the Secretary of State is visiting Pakistan, and even today there were headlines about violence in the area. How do you see that trip going?
Well, I think the trip is going well as those things do. I mean, she is working on the U.S.-Pakistan agenda. She is trying to give publicity to the interest of the United States in encouraging the Pakistani economy, in working with viable political institutions in Pakistan. In other words, she is trying to focus Pakistanis on the fact that the U.S. cares about more than just terrorism. But the terrorism part is grabbing the headlines because, you know, in any country, if it bleeds, it leads. And so that does tend to put a lot of attention on the fact that this is still a very troubled neighborhood, and that Pakistan is beset by an internal insurgency which has been much more violent in the past couple of years than anyone expected 4 or 5 years ago.
Do you think because of the world being flat today, that Americans are more aware of the tensions in that region?
They are certainly aware of the tensions. I think they're probably more aware of the tensions than of the possibilities. But there's an interesting asymmetry there. If you're talking to well-educated Pakistanis, if you're talking to well-educated Indians, they know quite a lot about the United States. There's a lot they don't know, but there's a lot they do know. And on average, Americans know less about their countries than they know about us.
In that sense, do you think that this mantra, or call it what you will, the world is flat, is an accurate portrayal of the world today? Or do you see it more in terms of hills and valleys?
I think it's more curved than Tom Friedman does. Certainly, globalization, the internationalization of education, the internationalization of business have brought people together in ways that would have been unimaginable a generation ago. That is true. There are 90,000 Indian students in this country. The number of Pakistani students is smaller, but still considerable. So, and there are any number of Indians and Pakistanis who have relatives in the United States. You talked about the Pakistani community in Atlanta. If you look at Washington, the Pakistani community includes PhDs that work at the World Bank or at international banks. It includes taxi drivers. It includes wait staff in some restaurants. It includes computer techies, the whole range. On the other hand, there are still parts of India and Pakistan that haven't really been caught up in globalization. And I would argue there are still parts of the United States that haven't been caught up in globalization. Look at the political controversy in this country over outsourcing. Now, there is a real issue because jobs move. They tend to move to where labor is cheaper, whether it's highly qualified or less qualified labor. On the other hand, what people don't see as much is that jobs move in both directions. And 20 years from now, there are things we will look back on and say this was progress, but at the time it will feel very painful. If you were making buggy whips in 1900 and you saw the horseless carriages come along, there was your livelihood. And we look back on that and say automobiles were a huge progress. And they're both true. The thing is, in the short term, there are people who suffer from progress. And I think that's true at the global level just as at the national level.
How disruptive can the sort of violence that we've seen in the last couple of days be to the process of economic development?
This can be a crippling disability. Where you see that most immediately is in Afghanistan. Inside Afghanistan, we have sunk a lot of money on economic development. Not necessarily a lot in relation to the size of the problems, but a lot in absolute terms. One of the reasons that it's had trouble really gaining traction is that in many parts of the country, life is insecure enough that it's hard for farmers to go out there and raise crops, that it's hard to build even rudimentary houses for people who have been in exile for the past 20 years. So how are you going to get a subsistence level economy going when the thing that gives them subsistence is so hard to do because of insecurity? In Pakistan, the insecurity problem operates at a slightly higher level. By and large, except in the most violence-affected areas, the farmers can still get out there and plant their crops. But what it affects is the willingness of people who might otherwise invest to found medium-sized businesses, or particularly foreigners who might invest in something on a larger scale. They're going to be much less willing to put their money at risk if 5 blocks away in downtown Lahore there's a police headquarters that's going to get blown up tomorrow. So that's the economic development hit you take. And of course there's also a political hit.
Do you think in terms of foreign aid, the United States has an effective policy that takes all these issues into account?
I think the United States has done a lot of good things with its foreign aid. I think that it is still groping for the best combination of strategies that are really going to be effective in Afghanistan and in Pakistan. And they're going to be different strategies because these are very different countries. Let me talk a bit about Pakistan. One of the problems that we face is the result of good intentions. The aid program has tried very hard to reach poor people at the bottom end of the scale with basic education, basic primary health, with institutional changes that are going to make these things more accessible. Because you're trying to operate at the grassroots level, your aid is kind of invisible to the elites. It's invisible to people who live in the cities. And for people who live in the villages, they don't see it as America's contribution. So how do you get some political payoff as well? Operating at the grassroots isn't a bad thing. But maybe if you're moving relatively large amounts of aid money, you need to do some other things too. I personally favor putting a little of that money into infrastructure. It's out of fashion in the development world, but in a country where power cuts have gotten up to 16 hours a day, having more electric power could be beneficial to everybody and could start to change the image of the United States. And that, I would suggest, is very important in creating the kind of collaborative relationship we want to have with the people of Pakistan that will ultimately permit us to work not just on their economic development problems, but on our larger security problems.
When Secretary of State Clinton was in India, I think she signed some sort of agreement that we would help with the development of nuclear facilities for power there. Do you support that policy? Do you think that's a good idea?
What this is part of the implementation of the agreement on civil nuclear cooperation that was put in place under the Bush administration. I do support it. It's been a very controversial policy because it changes some of the ways in which we implement the Non-Proliferation Treaty. But I do think it was important to deal with the nuclear taboo that had become such an impediment to larger relations with India. But I think it's important to be very clear about what this is. This is an agreement that we are willing to sell India, not give it, equipment that's related to their civilian nuclear power needs in facilities that they have designated as civilian and which will be under safeguards.
Will this be appreciated in India?
I think the big policy change was appreciated, although, as so often happens in India, it was also controversial, largely because of the history of our nuclear relations with India, which led the Indian nuclear establishment to see the United States as the country that had been trying to keep them down.